I'm standing in our apartment with my girlfriend's sister behind me. Iris unpacks fruit, unaware everything is collapsing. Her mother sleeps down the hall. She's still trying to control me, and I finally understand I can't live like this. I look at her arranging things perfectly, and say the words that change everything. I'm leaving you. Her face shifts. She realizes, too late, that her sister has been waiting for this moment. But the person she doesn't see coming is me. Finally choosing myself, finally taking up space, finally refusing to be small. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. Iris Mercer had spent her entire childhood learning that control was love. Her father had left when she was 12, and her mother Helen had responded by reorganizing everything: how meals were prepared, where Iris could go, who she could see. Helen called this structure. She called it protection. What it was a way of managing fear by making the world smaller and more predictable. Iris had inherited this exactly. By the time I met her, she had perfected it to an art form, the kind of invisible control that doesn't announce itself as control but as care, as concern, as deep attention to what was best for everyone around her. She was 31 years old when we met at a non-profit conference. She was giving a panel on social impact investing. I was in the audience because my boss had suggested I should understand the funding landscape better. She was wearing a charcoal blazer that fit her precisely, the kind of clothing that suggests someone has thought carefully about every seam, every button, every way the fabric would sit against her body. When she spoke, she did so with the kind of absolute certainty that made you want to believe her immediately. There was no hedging in her voice, no uncertainty, just clean, articulate conviction about how the world should work and how money should move through it. After her panel, I was at the hotel bar. She found me there, which I later realized was not accidental. She had been looking for me. She said my question during the Q&A had demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how foundation grant cycles actually worked, and she would be happy to explain. She said it with a smile, which made it sound like flirtation instead of criticism. The smile was calculated. I understand that now. She was already assessing me, already deciding whether I was the kind of person who could be redirected, whether I would accept her version of reality if she presented it with enough confidence. I bought her a drink. She ordered something specific, a particular bourbon, neat, that the bartender had to go to the back to find. It was the kind of order that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted and expected to get it. She told me about the bourbon while we waited for it. She told me about the distillery, about the specific characteristics of the grain, about the year it was produced. She made it sound like a choice with significant meaning, like ordering this particular bourbon instead of another was evidence of discernment and taste. By the end of the night, she had convinced me that I should spend the next 3 years working in nonprofit exclusively, and I had agreed without recognizing that I was agreeing to let her help reorganize my entire life. What I didn't understand then was that the confidence she displayed was not born from security, it was born from fear. She was afraid of uncertainty, afraid of chaos, afraid of anything that might slip outside her control. So she had learned to manage everything herself, her environment, the people around her. She had learned to present absolute certainty about everything because uncertainty felt like drowning to her. She had learned to make other people's choices for them because if everyone was doing what she thought they should be doing, then nothing bad could happen. It was a math that never quite worked, but she kept trying to make it balance anyway. What I didn't understand then was that she wasn't doing this because she wanted to control me. She was doing it because control was the only way she knew how to love something. If she could anticipate your needs before you named them, if she could shape the landscape of your life so carefully that nothing unexpected could touch you, then she was keeping you safe. And if she was keeping you safe, then you were hers to protect. It was a circular logic that I didn't recognize until much later, when I was already too deep inside it to see clearly. The first 6 months were good. She was attentive in ways that felt like care. She texted me midday to check on how my meetings were going. She made reservations at restaurants she thought I would like, and she was usually right, which was disconcerting in a way I couldn't articulate. She listened to my work stories with the kind of focused attention that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told my best friend Marcus that I thought I had finally met someone who actually understood me. Marcus had gone quiet on the phone, which in retrospect was his way of trying to warn me that understanding can be weaponized. He said, "Just be careful, okay?" And I, secure in my newfound happiness, assured him there was nothing to be careful about. By month 8, the redirects had begun. She mentioned that my career path seemed scattered. Wouldn't I be happier focusing specifically on nonprofit work? She said it softly, while we were cooking dinner together, like it was just a thought she was sharing, not a suggestion that was rapidly becoming a requirement. But the way she said it, with absolute certainty, made disagreeing feel impossible. Disagreeing would mean proving that I knew my own life better than she did. Disagreeing would mean risking the stability we had built. Disagreeing would mean being ungrateful for her attention. By month 10, she had introduced me to people in that sector, had made clear these were the people I should prioritize, had somehow communicated that my old friends were less useful to me now. She didn't say it directly. She just made comments about how my old friends didn't seem to understand the work, or how they seemed a little aimless. She would ask about my conversations with them in a way that suggested they were wasting my time. It happened gradually enough that I didn't notice the moment when my social calendar became something she was managing. One day, I realized I hadn't talked to Marcus in 3 weeks, then a month, then 2 months. And by then, the distance had become the default. It happened gradually enough that I didn't notice the moment when my social calendar became something she was managing. By month 14, I moved in with her. By month 18, I had changed jobs. I remember the moment I told her I had accepted the nonprofit position. She smiled in that particular way she had, not with joy, but with satisfaction. Like she had solved a problem that had been bothering her. Like she had successfully reorganized a piece of my life that wasn't sitting right in her worldview. I had not realized I was being reorganized because the reorganizing was being done very carefully, and because I wanted to believe that it was for my own good. When I questioned a redirect, she would explain the reasoning so patiently, so logically, that I would end up apologizing for my initial resistance. She had a way of making me feel like my instincts were slightly off, like I wasn't seeing the full picture the way she could see it. She was older, more established, had been in nonprofit longer. Of course she understood these things better than I did. The first time she redirected my cooking, we had invited some people over. She mentioned, gently, that she had noticed I got anxious when I was managing both the meal and the hosting, and that she would prefer to handle the cooking so I could relax. I accepted this because it sounded plausible. It also sounded caring. She was noticing something about me and offering to help. Who was I to reject an offer like that? Once she said it, I started looking for evidence that it was true, and of course I found some, because you can always find evidence of anything if you look hard enough. You can find proof that you're anxious when you're already worried about being anxious. I started second-guessing my movements in the kitchen. I started wondering if my hands were shaking more than usual. I started interpreting normal pre-hosting nerves as evidence of deep-seated anxiety. By the time she offered to take over, I was almost grateful, almost relieved. She had identified a problem in me and offered a solution, and I had been stupid enough to accept it as wisdom, instead of recognizing it as a power move. I stopped cooking when we had guests. Then I stopped cooking on weekends. Then she mentioned that my grocery shopping was inefficient, that I was buying things that didn't align with what she'd already planned, that I was making extra work for her by not understanding the meal plans she had in her head. We fell into a pattern where she managed food entirely. I didn't notice it happening because I was too busy accepting her interpretation of each shift as wisdom. And also, because once you start accepting small reorganizations, bigger ones feel like natural progressions. Like if I was anxious about cooking with people around, it made sense that I would also be inefficient at grocery shopping. Like these redirects were just acknowledgments of truths about myself that I had failed to recognize. What I didn't understand was that she was manufacturing these truths. She was creating the anxiety she then offered to solve. She was making me doubt my competence so she could demonstrate her superiority. She was slowly erasing me from spaces I used to occupy with confidence. This morning's note was different. This morning's note was an announcement of authority. It said, "Please just let me handle the meal prep this visit. Mom responds better when things are done a certain way. It's easier if you stay out of it. Thank you for understanding." Understanding. That word worked hard in that sentence. It suggested I was capable of it. It suggested I would be unreasonable if I wasn't. It suggested that this was a reasonable request born of legitimate concern, rather than what it actually was, a woman telling another woman that her presence in her own kitchen was going to be a problem. The note was on expensive paper. Her handwriting was perfect, the kind of neat script that comes from someone who practices control in every detail. She had taken time to write this. This was not a casual redirect. This was a formal statement of boundary. A declaration of ownership. I had spent the morning sitting in that immaculate kitchen, staring at that note, trying to identify the moment I had become someone who could be reorganized so efficiently. The kitchen was spotless in a way that felt aggressive, every surface gleaming. Nothing out of place, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. Iris kept it this way to make Helen's arrival less of a shock. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to demonstrate that Iris was in control, that she managed her life with precision, that she was worth Helen's approval. I thought about calling Marcus. He would have opinions about this. He had tried to tell me, about 18 months ago, that he was worried about how much space Iris was taking up in my life, and I had defended her with a loyalty that, in retrospect, looked like something else entirely. I had told Marcus that he didn't understand her, that he wasn't seeing how much she cared about me. I had told him that her attention was love, not control. Now, sitting with this note in my hands, I understood what Marcus had been trying to say. I just didn't know how to undo 2 years of reorganization. I didn't call Marcus. I sat with the note and I felt something in me finally starting to resist. At noon, Iris's sister Mira called. Mira was 2 years older than Iris, lived 40 minutes away in the city proper, and had the particular steadiness of someone who had stopped trying to manage family dynamics and had instead opted out of most of them entirely. She had a different relationship to the world than Iris did. Where Iris moved through spaces trying to control them, Mira moved through spaces like she belonged in them. There was a confidence in her that didn't seem to require validation. She called me regularly, which would have been strange except that I had gathered, over time, that she actively preferred talking to me to talking to her sister. We had a rhythm that required no explanation. She didn't perform for me. I didn't have to figure out what was happening underneath her words. With Iris, conversation was always a negotiation. With Mira, it was just talking. She said, "Mom's arriving tonight." I said, "I know." My stomach was tight. Helen's visits always seemed to trigger something in Iris, made her more controlling, more anxious, more determined to demonstrate mastery over every detail of her life. She said, "And Iris has made requests." I said, "How did you know that?" She said, "Because my sister is predictable and scared. She's been the same way since she was 17, since the time Mom criticized her lasagna and Iris cried for 2 hours. She's been trying to earn Mom's approval ever since." I'm guessing something kitchen-related? I laughed despite myself. The laugh felt like the first real thing I had done all morning. There was something about Mira's directness that cut through all the careful language Iris used. With Mira, you didn't have to decode what was actually being said. I said, "She told me to stay out of the kitchen for the entire visit. Her entire visit. Not just for special meals. The entire time her mother is here." Mira was quiet. I could hear her moving, stepping into another room, closing a door, creating privacy for a conversation that mattered. I could picture her exactly, doing this in her warehouse apartment, moving to a space where she could speak freely without judgment. She said, "That's new. Iris doesn't usually say it that explicitly. Usually she just makes you feel like you should want to stay out of it. Usually she creates circumstances where not cooking feels like your choice. The fact that she's saying it directly means she's scared of something very specific." I said, "What?" She said, "I need to think about this. I'm going to call you back." She hung up. I spent the afternoon in a particular kind of waiting. Not waiting for Helen to arrive, that was happening regardless of how I felt about it. Waiting for permission to be angry about something that shouldn't have needed permission. waiting for external validation of my own instinct, which was something I had been trained to do over the past year. When Iris corrected me, or redirected me, I had learned to assume immediately that her read on the situation was more accurate than mine. Her certainty was so complete that my own doubt always seemed reasonable. So I was waiting now for Mira to call back and tell me whether I should be angry, whether my instinct was correct, whether what I was feeling in my chest was legitimate, or if I was being unreasonable. This, too, was part of what Iris had done to me. She had trained me to stop trusting myself. At 4:30, Mira texted, "I'm coming early, bringing dinner. We need to talk before Mom gets there." At 4:45, she was at my apartment door. Mira was the thing Iris was not. She was warm without being soft, direct without being unkind, and completely comfortable with the fact that some people would not like her and this was their problem to manage, not hers. She didn't need anyone's approval, which meant she didn't reorganize herself to get it. She was wearing dark jeans and a sweater in deep charcoal gray that looked expensive in the way things do when they're made from good materials and designed for someone who knows how to wear them. She had her hair in a braid she had probably done herself. She moved through the world like she owned it, which is different from moving through the world like you're renting it and terrified of damaging something that doesn't actually belong to you. She went directly to the kitchen without asking permission. She didn't apologize for taking up space. She unpacked groceries with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was making and why she was making it. Good olive oil that smelled like sunlight and earth, fresh pasta she had apparently made that morning, basil wrapped in damp paper towels, tomatoes she had clearly selected with care, spending time at the market choosing ones that were ripe but not overripe, with that specific quality that comes from attention. Garlic. A bottle of wine that probably cost money. There was something almost defiant about the way she moved through the kitchen. She wasn't asking Iris for permission, wasn't apologizing for her presence, wasn't performing gratitude for being allowed to exist in the space. She was simply cooking, like this was something she had every right to do. She said, "When is Iris getting home?" I said, 5:30. She was very specific about her timeline. She said, "Then we have 45 minutes, sit down." I sat at the kitchen counter and watched her cook. She moved through the space like it was an extension of her own body. She didn't ask where things were. She found the best knife without hesitation. She knew this kitchen. She had spent time here when I wasn't watching. There was an intimacy in that knowledge that made me realize how many versions of my own apartment existed without me in them, and Mira was welcome in all of them. She said, "I called Mom this morning." I waited. Mira's relationship with Helen was different from Iris's. She didn't need Helen's approval the way Iris did. But she still had to navigate the dynamics, had to understand what was happening in her mother's mind. She said, "She called Iris last week, told her that living with someone you're not married to is going to end badly, that Iris should be careful about getting too attached to you, that the relationship is probably not going anywhere because you're not moving toward marriage fast enough." I stared at her. The weight of that made sense suddenly. Helen's judgment. Helen's disapproval. Helen deciding that I was not a permanent fixture in Iris's life. And Iris, desperately trying to prove something by demonstrating that she had perfect control over her environment, perfect control over me. She said, "So Iris has decided to prove something by being the most compliant daughter possible while Mom is here. If she can demonstrate that she has total control over her environment, if she can show that she's not letting you take up too much space, then maybe Mom will think she's being smart. Maybe Mom will think she's not making a mistake by allowing you to stay in her life." The basil was being shredded now, Mira's fingers working through it with confident precision. There was something meditative about the way she was cooking, like she was working through a problem by moving her hands. She said, "This is not about whether your cooking is good. This is not about Mom's preferences around food. This is about Iris showing Mom that she can control everything, including you. If you're in the kitchen making decisions, if you're suggesting menus, if you're moving through that space with any autonomy at all, then you become real. You become a person with agency, and that threatens the narrative Iris is trying to present to her mother. The narrative is, I am in control, everything is managed. I am not letting this relationship destabilize my life." I said, "How do you know all of this?" she said, because I've watched her do it before. Because I lived in a house with our mother for 20 years, and I recognize the pattern. Iris learned very early that if you anticipate what the people around you need, if you manage everyone's expectations perfectly, if you control the environment so thoroughly that nothing unexpected can happen, then you might be safe. You might be loved. You might be enough. She had moved on to the sauce now, the tomatoes being broken down with a knife into something warm and rich and real. She was crushing garlic with the side of the blade, not using a press. The whole kitchen was starting to smell like something genuine, something made with intention. She said, "Our mother had a particular way of showing love. She would create these structures, these systems where everything was managed and controlled. She called it care. What it was fear expressed as authority. She was terrified that if she didn't control everything, the world would hurt us. So she tried to make the world smaller. She tried to predict every variable, manage every outcome, protect us from anything that might surprise her. And for a long time, it worked. We were safe. We didn't get hurt. But we also didn't get to breathe. We didn't get to make mistakes and learn from them. We didn't get to be people. We got to be projects." Mira paused. She was looking down at her hands, at the tomatoes she was breaking down. She said. Iris absorbed this. She learned that love looks like control. She learned that the way to keep someone safe is to make their choices for them. She learned that if she could anticipate every problem, prevent every mistake, predict every outcome, then nothing bad would happen to the people she loved. The problem is that people are not problems to be solved. They're not puzzles to be figured out and reorganized. They're just people. They're messy and unpredictable, and sometimes they make choices you don't understand. And if you try to control them, if you try to make them smaller so they fit inside your understanding of how things should be, you eventually destroy them. Or they destroy you by leaving. Either way, something breaks. She was looking at me now while she cooked. She was waiting for me to understand something. Something about the nature of love and control, about how they can look identical from the inside. She said, "You shouldn't let her do this." I said, "She's your sister." She said, "I know. I'm telling you anyway. Because I love her enough to tell you the truth about what she's doing. Because I've watched this pattern destroy other relationships. Because I can see exactly what's happening, and I'm not going to pretend it's something else just to protect her feelings." At 5:20, the kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil and fresh tomatoes, like something real had been created here with intention. Mira plated it carefully. She set the table with attention to each element, napkins folded correctly, wine glasses positioned, the food arranged like it mattered. She poured wine. She stepped back and looked at her work like an artist reviewing something she had made. There was pride in it, not arrogance, just the satisfaction of having done something well. I said, "It's beautiful." She said, "It's dinner." What's beautiful is that I made it without asking anyone's permission, and nobody here is going to make me feel like I should have. That's the thing your girlfriend doesn't understand yet. That taking up space isn't something you need permission for. It's just something you do. When Iris came home at 5:47 exactly on time, because Iris was always exactly on time, she stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was lit. The table was set. There was wine and fresh pasta and garlic bread, and her sister was standing at the counter like the space belonged to her. Which, I was starting to understand, it did. Mira moved through the world like she owned the space she was standing in. Iris moved through the world like she was renting it and terrified of the damage deposit. Iris looked at me first. She was reading the situation, assessing the threat. She was looking for some indication that I had been disloyal in her absence, that I had somehow allowed someone else to take her place. I could see the calculation happening in her face. The quick assessment of damage. Then she looked at Mira. She said, "What are you doing here?" Mira said, "I decided to cook dinner. Mom will be here in 10 minutes. I thought we should eat before she arrives so we can all be calm when she gets there." It was a perfect deflection. It suggested helpfulness and foresight. It didn't mention that Iris had forbidden me from cooking. It created space for Iris to accept the situation without losing face, which was generous, which was also a kind of power move. But underneath it was something else. a current between the sisters that I was only starting to understand. Something about Mira choosing to do things differently. Something about Mira refusing to accept Iris's version of how things should be. Iris said, "I was planning to do something simple." Mira said, "I know. I wanted to do something good instead." The words were kind. The tone was not. When Helen arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, Helen was punctual in the way people are when they use punctuality. As evidence of moral superiority, the meal was being served. Mira was the one plating, her movements deliberate and assured. Mira was explaining the pasta, the sauce, the technique. Mira was commanding the kitchen and the narrative around it, like it had always been hers to command. I watched Iris's face while she watched this. I watched her trying to decide whether to claim credit for what Mira had done, or accept the situation gracefully, or redirect in some way that would make her the center of the attention. She chose silence, which was the most telling thing she could have chosen. Iris went quiet when she felt threatened. Helen was warm to me in the particular way of people assessing whether you're worth their approval. She asked about my work. She asked about my family. She asked how Iris was treating me, which sounded casual until you understood it was an audit, a test to see if I was satisfied with her daughter's management of me. I said, "She takes good care of me." Helen said, "That's lovely. Iris has always been conscientious." It was compliment and correction at once. It suggested that if I wasn't satisfied with how I was being treated, the problem was probably me. It suggested that a woman who was caring for you should be sufficient. You should not need anything else. It suggested that gratitude was the appropriate response to being managed. Through the meal, Mira orchestrated things with an ease that suggested she did this regularly. She asked Helen questions that got her talking about stories I had never heard, about Iris's childhood, about the years when Iris's father was still there, and Helen wasn't yet terrified he would leave, about the difficult period after he left, and Helen responded by tightening her grip on the only things she could control. Mira listened with genuine attention. She asked follow-up questions. She refilled wine glasses before anyone asked. She moved through the meal like a woman who had decided she belonged at this table and was not going to apologize for it. And when her eyes met mine, briefly, there was something in them that was asking a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. Helen was telling a story about Iris's confirmation, about how nervous Iris had been, how Iris had memorized not just her own responses but everyone else's in case someone forgot. Helen told this like it was an amusing anecdote. Mira listened with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what Helen wasn't saying, that even then, even as a child, Iris had been trying to control everything so nothing could surprise her, so nothing could hurt her. That Helen had passed this to her as if it were a gift, a necessary survival mechanism, instead of what it actually was, a way of moving through the world that would eventually make it impossible to love freely. Iris was quiet during this story. She was focused on her pasta, pushing food around her plate without eating much. She was not enjoying this meal that Mira had made. She was tolerating it. She was waiting for it to be over so she could resume the version of events she had planned, so she could return to the narrative where she was in control. You could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set, the energy it was taking her to sit there and not try to manage what was happening. After dinner, Helen said she was tired from driving and wanted to lie down. Iris showed her to the guest room, and I watched her turn that space into a presentation. Fresh towels, fresh soap, a lamp with a warm bulb that wouldn't be too harsh, water on the nightstand. Iris had prepared that room with the kind of attention that suggested she had been preparing for Helen's arrival for weeks, maybe months. Every detail was considered. Every element was curated. She had turned it into a statement. Look how capable I am. Look how well I manage my life. Look how little space any of you actually take up in my world. Mira and I cleared the dishes without discussing it. She washed. I dried. We moved around each other in the kitchen with an ease that felt new and old at the same time, like we had done this before in another lifetime and were remembering our way back into it. The synchronization was natural. I would hand her a plate and she would know exactly where to put it in the rack. We didn't have to negotiate or explain. We just moved together, the way people do when they understand something without words. In the kitchen, with the door closed behind us and Helen down the hallway settling into the guest room, Mira said quietly, "You should break up with her." I stopped moving. I was holding a plate. I became very aware of the plate, of my hands holding it, of the weight of something that should have been negligible but somehow felt enormous. I said, "That's a serious suggestion." She said, "I know." I said, "You're her sister." She said, "I know that too. I'm still suggesting it." I set the plate down very carefully. I sat at the counter. The kitchen was still warm from cooking, still smelled like the meal, like something real had happened here. I said, "Why?" Mira was loading the dishwasher with the same efficiency she had used to cook. She was not looking at me while she answered. She was giving me space to hear this without feeling like I had to perform gratitude or agreement or anything else. She said, "Because I've watched her do this before. Because it starts exactly like this: small redirects, reasonable-sounding requests, the slow erosion of your right to exist in your own space. Because Iris is my sister and I love her, and I also know that she's terrified, and when she's terrified, she tries to control everything around her, so the fear becomes manageable. And because I think the person you are under all this control is worth protecting. I think the woman who wants to cook and make noise and take up space deserves to do those things." She closed the dishwasher and turned around. She was standing in front of the window now, backlit by city lights. She looked like someone who had learned how to stand in the world without asking for permission first. She said, "And because I think you deserve someone who wants you in the kitchen, who wants you loud and present, and taking up space, someone who doesn't have to manage you to feel safe." I looked at her, really looked at her. She was 33 years old. She was wearing a sweater that fit her perfectly. She had laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she actually laughed, that joy was something she allowed herself to experience. She was looking at me with a directness that Iris had trained me to find slightly threatening. But standing here, watching her backlit by the city lights, I understood that the threat wasn't to me. It was to the life I had accepted. It was to the version of myself that had learned to ask permission. I said, "Is that what you're offering?" She said, "No. I'm offering to send Iris for groceries tomorrow morning. I'm offering to spend the day with you. And I'm offering to be honest about what my sister is doing to you." I said, "What happens after tomorrow?" She said, "That's yours to decide." But the way she said it suggested she already knew what I was going to choose. And that suggestion was its own kind of power. Not the power to control, but the power of certainty. The power of someone who believes in you so completely that they can wait patiently while you catch up to their faith. When Iris came back into the kitchen, she stopped. She was reading the space between us, the specific distance we had created. She was calculating whether this distance represented threat. I could see her mind working, assessing, trying to figure out what had happened while she was gone. She said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yes." Mira said, "I'm heading out. Let you two have the evening." But before she left, she did something small. She looked, and in that look was an entire conversation about what I was tolerating, what I deserved, and what was about to change. After she left, Iris and I moved through the apartment like people performing the role of a couple. We talked about Helen, about the upcoming days, about nothing that mattered. Iris was tense in a way that suggested she knew something had shifted but could not quite locate what. She asked me if I had liked the pasta. She suggested that maybe tomorrow we could order takeout instead of cooking, which was a reversal from this morning's note but was also a test. She wanted to know if I was still complying, if I was still in reach, if she could still reorganize me. I said, "Whatever you think is best." She relaxed slightly at this. She was getting what she needed from me: agreement, flexibility, the willingness to not insist on my own preferences. I could see her body settle as she received this confirmation that I was still hers to manage, that I hadn't broken free of her control, that the power dynamic was still intact. I lay in bed that night knowing that Mira had been right, knowing that Iris was trying to make me smaller, knowing that I had been helping her do it, and more than that, I had been complicit in my own shrinking. I had accepted the redirects. I had internalized her versions of reality. I had made myself smaller because it was easier than arguing, because conflict meant risking her approval, because I was terrified of being left the way her father had left. and knowing, with absolute certainty, that tomorrow morning when Mira sent Iris for groceries, everything was going to change. The next morning, Iris woke up with a plan. I could see it in the way she moved through the apartment, the particular energy of someone who had spent the night reorganizing strategy. She was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs at 7, and she had that expression she got when she was about to execute something she had decided was necessary. She said, "Mom wants fresh fruit for breakfast. Will you go get some?" The good kind from the market on 5th, the ones that are picked that day. She prefers them that way. It was a test. It was also, I realized immediately, exactly what Mira had been waiting for. Iris was going to send me away from the apartment, and when I was gone, Mira would have the opening she needed. The morning would stretch out with space and silence, and everything I had been holding inside would have room to exist. I said, "Of course." Iris relaxed. She had gotten what she needed: compliance, agreement, the confirmation that I was still hers to direct. She gave me cash without asking if I had my own money, which was something she did regularly, the small assertion of authority disguised as helpfulness. She pressed 2 20s into my hand and said, "Just pick up whatever you think is best. You know what she likes." But I didn't know what Helen liked. She had only visited twice. What I knew was that I was being managed. What I knew was that in 5 minutes, I was going to walk out of this apartment and nothing was going to be the same when I came back. I left at 8:15. At 8:20, my phone buzzed. A text from Mira. She just texted me about going to the market. "Come back to my place. I'll explain everything." I drove to Mira's apartment instead of the market. I didn't go to 5th Street. I went to the converted warehouse space that Mira had renovated herself over the past 5 years. Everything about it was intentional, the way she had chosen where to put walls, how to light the space, what to keep and what to remove. It was the opposite of Iris's apartment, which was designed to be perfect, to control how others perceived her. Mira's space was designed to be lived in. It was designed for someone who wasn't afraid to take up room. Mira was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. She was wearing dark jeans and a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and she looked like she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Not waiting, like she was patient. Waiting like she had known this was going to happen and had prepared for it. She said, "Sit down, I need to explain something." We went into her kitchen. I sat at the counter. Mira made coffee 2 mugs, exact amounts, like she had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. She set one in front of me without asking if I wanted it. She knew I needed it. She was paying attention in that way that Iris paid attention, but with a fundamental difference. Iris's attention was about knowing what you needed so she could provide it and thereby keep you obligated to her. Mira's attention was about seeing you clearly and meeting you there. She said, "My sister called me this morning and asked me to pick her up from the market at 9:30 because her car is in the shop. She doesn't know that what she's actually asking me to do is take her away from the apartment for an hour. She doesn't know that she's asking me to give you space to make a decision, but that's what she's doing." I said, "Why did you agree?" She said, "Because this is the moment. This is the moment where you either go back to that apartment and resume accepting what she's doing to you, or you use the time you have to understand that you don't have to accept it anymore." She moved across the kitchen and leaned against the counter. She was looking at me the way Iris had learned to look at me, with complete attention. But where Iris's attention was about control, about managing and predicting and organizing, Mira's attention was about seeing, about witnessing, about understanding without needing to redirect. She said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it all the way through. I need you to not interrupt. I need you to let me say all of it. Can you do that?" I nodded. She sat across from me. She took a breath. I could see that whatever she was about to say was costing her something. There was a vulnerability in her face that I hadn't seen before. She said, "I have been in love with you since the first time Iris brought you to a family dinner. You were trying so hard to be acceptable, to be the right version of yourself, and you were already diminishing yourself before anyone asked you to. I watched you over the past 2 years get smaller and smaller. I watched you disappear, and every time I watched you disappear a little more, it broke something in me. Because I could see it happening. I could see exactly what Iris was doing. And I couldn't stop it without interfering in my sister's relationship, and Iris is my sister, and I love her, even though she's doing something destructive. I opened my mouth and she held up her hand. She said, "Let me finish. I'm not telling you this because I expect you to feel the same way right now. I'm not telling you this because I think you should leave her and immediately be with me. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that someone is seeing you completely. Someone is watching you disappear and is saying, no, this is not okay. Someone thinks you're worth protecting. And someone believes that you should take up space in your own kitchen and in your own life without apologizing for it." She set her coffee down. Her hands were steady, but I could see that saying this had taken something from her. There was a vulnerability here that she was offering to me, and the offering itself was an act of care. She said, "What happens next is entirely yours to decide. But I want you to know, right now, in this moment, that there is another option. There is a version of your life where you don't have to be managed, where you don't have to check in before you make decisions, where you can cook in your own kitchen without permission or explanation, where taking up space is not something you have to earn." I said, "Iris loves me." She said, "I know she does. I know she loves you. Love and control are not mutually exclusive. They never have been. Our mother loved us. She also reorganized our entire lives to fit her understanding of how things should be. Iris learned from her that love looks like that. That love looks like managing someone's choices so they can't make mistakes. That love looks like control. That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it understandable. And it means she's repeating a pattern instead of breaking one." I said, "What are you asking me to do?" She said, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I can offer. I can offer you honesty. I can offer you a person who doesn't need to manage you to feel safe. I can offer you a kitchen where you can cook without asking permission or explaining yourself. I can offer you a life where taking up space is not something you have to apologize for or negotiate or earn. I can offer you someone who will love you by letting you be free instead of by controlling you." She looked at the clock on her wall. It was 9:17. She said, "You have 13 minutes to decide what you want to tell Iris, what you want to do, what you want your life to look like. No pressure, no judgment either way. But I needed you to know that there's a choice. That staying is a choice too, and it's one you're making with full information." I sat there. I thought about the past 2 years. I thought about the way Iris had organized me, slowly and carefully, like I was a problem she was solving. I thought about the way Mira had been watching, waiting, understanding without needing me to perform for her. I thought about the kitchen. I thought about cooking. I thought about making a meal for people I cared about without checking with Iris first, without asking permission, without explaining myself. I thought about a life where I wasn't constantly managing whether I was acceptable. I said, "I need to break up with her." Mira didn't look triumphant. She looked sad and relieved, and like she had known this was going to happen from the beginning but had hoped she was wrong, had hoped Iris would change, had hoped I would decide to stay. There was grief in her face. The grief of someone who loves both people involved in a situation that can't be resolved without hurting someone. She said, "Okay." She said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pick her up from the market on time. We're going to go back to the apartment together. And you're going to tell her, with me there as a witness, that you're moving out, that the relationship is over. And then you're going to stay with me for a while, and we're going to figure out what comes next." We picked Iris up at 9:30 exactly. She got in the car with a bag of fruit, organic, expensive, the kind she had told me Helen preferred without asking Helen directly. She started talking immediately about how to prepare the fruit, about the way she wanted to structure the breakfast, about the small details she was managing to make everything perfect. She didn't notice that the car felt different. She didn't notice that Mira and I had shifted into a new configuration, that something had changed between us while she was away. Back at the apartment, Iris started unpacking the fruit at the kitchen counter. She was moving through the space like she owned it, like every decision about what happened here was hers to make. Helen was still asleep in the guest room. The morning was quiet and full of possibility for control, for reorganization, for the slow reshaping of another person's life. I said, "Iris, I need to talk to you." She turned. She read my face, and I watched the fear move across her expression. The fear that her control was slipping. The fear that I was about to make a decision she couldn't reorganize, couldn't manage, couldn't reshape into something that fit her narrative. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I'm moving out." A silence. She was calculating. She was trying to figure out how to fix this, how to reorganize it into something manageable. She was looking for the angle, the approach, the right way to redirect this moment so it became something she could control. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean that this relationship is built on you reorganizing me, and I've let it happen because I wanted to be loved. And I convinced myself that if I could just be the right version of myself, if I could just anticipate what you needed, if I could just manage your feelings about me, then it would be okay. But it's not okay. It's not okay for me to disappear. It's not okay for me to ask permission to cook in my own kitchen. It's not okay for me to need someone else's approval to make decisions about my own life." Mira was standing behind me. I could feel her presence without needing to see her. She was my witness. She was my proof that I wasn't crazy for seeing this clearly. I said, "I'm leaving. I'm moving to Mira's. I'm going to find my own place. I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be small enough to fit inside your control." Iris looked at Mira, and I watched her understand. I watched her see, for the first time, that her sister had not come here to support her. That her sister had come here to support me. That Mira had been watching all along, had been waiting for this moment, had been preparing for it. I could see the pieces clicking into place in her mind, the dinner, the conversation, the way Mira had positioned herself between us. And worse than that, I could see her realize that she had done this to herself. That by pushing and controlling and reorganizing, she had created the exact conditions for me to leave. She had made herself unbearable to be around by trying so hard to be bearable. She had made herself unlovable by loving too much in the wrong way. She said, "You're leaving me for my sister." I said, "I'm leaving you because I need to. I'm leaving you because staying would require me to disappear more. The fact that Mira is here is separate. It's not about Mira, it's about me." But that was a lie. And Iris knew it was a lie. And I knew it was a lie. Mira was not separate. Mira was the person who had shown me that another way was possible. Mira was the person who had said, without asking anything in return, that I deserved better. Iris sat down. She was very still. She was the kind of still that comes right before something breaks. She said, "I love you." I said, "I know. But your love looks like control. And I can't live inside that." Mira said, "We're going to give you some time. Pack a bag with what you need for the next week. We'll come back this evening to get the rest of your things." But Iris was already starting to reorganize. I could see it happening in real time. She was already figuring out how to make this my fault, how to restructure the narrative so that she was the wronged party, how to make my leaving seem like a betrayal rather than self-preservation. She was going to tell people that I had chosen her sister. She was going to paint this as infidelity rather than escape. It was what happened when you tried to control everything, when things finally slipped out of your grasp. You broke them in your effort to hold on. I packed a bag. Mira helped me. We moved through the apartment with the clarity of people who had decided something and were executing it. I took clothes, my laptop, the few things that were actually mine. I didn't take much. I didn't need to. I was just leaving the structure. I was just stepping out of the cage. When we left, Iris was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. She looked like a woman who had just realized that her control had never actually worked the way she thought it did, that it had never made her safe, that it had never made anyone love her more. She looked like someone who had lost something and was only now understanding what that something had cost her. I stayed with Mira for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleeping in a guest room that was beautiful and didn't feel like a performance. 3 weeks of waking up and not feeling like I had to manage someone else's feelings about my existence. 3 weeks of cooking in Mira's kitchen without asking permission, without explaining my choices, without waiting for approval. 3 weeks of learning how to take up space. The guest room was small but perfect. It had a window that looked out onto the city. The bed was comfortable in a way that felt like it was designed for rest instead of performance. There were no expectations here. No note about how I should arrange things. No subtle corrections about the way I was living. Just space and permission and the radical act of being allowed to simply exist. In that 3 weeks, I had to learn how to make choices without checking with someone else first. I had to learn how to exist in shared space without performing acceptability. I had to learn how to trust my own judgment again, after 2 years of accepting Iris's versions of reality as superior to my own. Mira didn't try to replace Iris's control with her own. She just waited. She made breakfast if I wanted it. She didn't make breakfast if I didn't want it. She asked what I wanted to do with my day, and actually listened to the answer, instead of redirecting it toward what she thought would be best. It was revolutionary in its simplicity. It was also terrifying. Without someone managing my choices, I had to actually figure out what I wanted. And I had gotten so used to having my preferences overridden that I wasn't sure I still had any. But slowly, over those 3 weeks, they came back. Small things at first. Wanting tea instead of coffee. Wanting to sleep in instead of rising early. Wanting to read instead of going out. Wanting quiet instead of conversation. The things that had been redirected back into shape by someone else's preferences were tentatively beginning to reassert themselves. I was beginning to remember what I wanted when nobody was telling me what I should want. On the last night of the 3rd week, Mira came into the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize, the expression of someone who was about to say something difficult, something that was going to cost her. She said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. She said, "I cannot be with you right now." I felt something in my chest stop moving. I felt it the way you feel in absence, like the air had changed, like the room had shifted, like the thing I had been expecting had just dissolved into something else entirely. She said, "Not because I don't want to. Not because what I said in my kitchen that morning wasn't true. Not because I don't love you, but because you just left someone who reorganized you, and I need you to understand that I will not do that. I need you to have time to figure out who you are when nobody is deciding things for you. I need you to be sure that if you choose me, you're choosing me because you want to. Not because I'm the alternative to Iris. Not because I'm the person who is waiting. Not because I'm what's available." I said, "How long?" She said, "As long as it takes. 6 months, a year, however long you need to know that your choices are actually yours." I said, "What if I decide I don't want you?" She said, "Then I'll know I did the right thing by letting you go. Then I'll know I loved you enough to give you space to figure out what you actually want, instead of just taking what I could get. Because if I don't let you go, if I keep you close while you're still figuring out who you are, then I become Iris. Then I become another person managing your choices, another person making decisions for you disguised as love. And I refuse to do that." She stood up. She said, "You can stay here as long as you need to. But we're going to establish some boundaries. You're going to find your own place. You're going to build a life that belongs to you first. You're going to spend some time being alone, being entirely your own person, making decisions based on what you want, instead of what someone else needs from you. And then, if you want to, you can decide whether I'm part of it." She left the room. I sat there understanding, for the first time, what love looked like when it wasn't about control. What it looked like when someone cared about you enough to not have you. What it looked like when someone was willing to step back and let you become yourself, even though it meant they might lose you. The next morning, I started apartment hunting. Mira helped me. We looked at places, and I made decisions based on what I wanted, not what someone else thought was best. It was harder than I expected. My instinct was to defer, to ask Mira's opinion, to let someone else organize the choice. I had to catch myself doing it, had to stop and ask myself, what do I want? Not what does Mira want, not what would be easiest for someone else. What do I want? But Mira never answered those questions for me. She would just say, "What do you want?" And she would wait while I figured it out, which was harder than being told what to do, but infinitely more valuable. I found an apartment 6 weeks later. It was small and imperfect and entirely mine. It had hardwood floors and a kitchen with good light. It had windows that looked out onto the street. It was not the apartment Mira would have chosen for me. It was the apartment I chose for myself. That mattered more than I could articulate. The kitchen was large enough that I could move through it freely. There was no one to tell me I couldn't cook. No one to suggest that my presence in that space was creating problems. No one to manage my decisions about what to make or when to make it. Mira helped me move in. She set a housewarming plant on my counter, something green and alive, and kissed me on the forehead and said, "I'll see you around." And then, she stepped back. She gave me space the way she had promised she would. For 3 months, we barely saw each other. We would run into each other occasionally, at the grocery store, at a coffee shop. We would talk like people who had once been close and were remembering how to be that again. We would talk about the weather, about work, about neutral things. It was respectful. It was also excruciating. It was the hardest 3 months of my life because she was there and not there, present and absent, available and unreachable. I missed her in a way that was complicated by the fact that I was supposed to be figuring out who I was without her. And figuring out who you are is impossible when you're preoccupied with someone else. So I tried to stay busy. I went to work. I came home. I tried to cook things and they tasted like loneliness. I tried to read books and couldn't concentrate because the text kept blurring into thoughts of her. I tried to sleep and woke up in the middle of the night reaching for someone who wasn't there. But slowly, over those 3 months, something shifted. I started to understand that Mira's refusal to be with me was not rejection. It was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for me. She was saying, without words, that my autonomy mattered more than her desires, that who I was becoming mattered more than what she wanted, that love sometimes looks like stepping back and letting someone become themselves. In month 4, I cooked a meal. Not for anyone. Just for myself. I made pasta from scratch the way Mira had taught me. I rolled the dough, really worked it, letting my hands learn the texture of the flour and eggs becoming something unified. I cut the ribbons carefully, watching them fall into nests. I made a sauce from tomatoes and garlic and thyme. I sat at my kitchen table and ate it alone and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I had permission to take up space and nobody was managing it, and I had done this entire thing without asking anyone's approval first. The pasta was not perfect. Some of the pieces were uneven. The sauce was maybe a little too acidic. But it was mine. It was exactly what I had made, without anyone's input or correction or suggestion that I could have done it better. I called Mira. I said, "I made your pasta." She said, "The one from that morning?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How was it?" I said, "It was mine. It was exactly what I wanted it to be." A pause. She said, "Do you want to cook it for someone?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay. Come over on Saturday. I'll bring wine." On Saturday, I went to her apartment. She was in the kitchen in an apron, the sleeves of her shirt rolled up. She was not cooking. She was waiting. She had been waiting, I understood, for me to be ready. She looked at me, and I could see the hope in her face tempered with the recognition that I might have come to tell her something different. That 3 months of separation might have clarified that I didn't need her, that I could be happy alone. I said, "Hi." She said, "Hi." Her voice was careful, like she was trying not to assume anything. I said, "I'm ready." She said, "Ready for what?" I said, "To decide, to choose, to know that I'm choosing you because I want to, not because I'm running from someone else, not because you're the alternative, because you're what I choose. Because these 3 months of not having you made me understand what I would lose if I didn't. Because I want to build a life with someone who lets me be free. And that someone is you." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure about this in a way I've never been sure about anything. I'm sure the way you're sure about things completely and without hedging. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing a kitchen where I can cook and be loud and make mistakes without someone reorganizing them into something I didn't intend." She didn't say anything. She just crossed the kitchen and kissed me. She crossed the kitchen and kissed me. It was not frantic. It was not desperate. It was patient. It was a kiss that had been waiting for 3 months and could wait 3 more if it needed to, but didn't have to. She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too. And I choose you. I'm choosing you. Right now, I'm choosing you." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that meant she had known this was going to happen from the beginning, but had needed me to know it too. She had needed me to get there on my own. We cooked together that night. We made pasta. We made sauce. We made bread. We made a meal that was entirely ours, with neither of us directing the other, both of us moving through the kitchen like people who had decided they belonged in the same space, like we had both agreed that this was where we wanted to be. We ate at her table, we drank wine, we talked about the past, about Iris, about the things I had learned about myself. We talked about the person I had been trying to be, and the person I actually was. We talked about control and love and the difference between the two. I said, "Have you seen her? Have you heard from Iris?" She said, "Once. At the grocery store about 2 months ago. She looks different. Smaller still, but also like she's trying. She's gone to therapy. She told me she's trying to understand what she was doing." I said, "Good. I hope she figures it out. Not for me. For her. Because she deserves to understand why she does what she does." She said, "I don't know if she'll ever fully understand, but I think she's trying, which is all any of us can do." I said, "Yeah." After dinner, we moved to her couch. She pulled me against her and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, like I was not being managed, like I was being held instead of controlled. Like taking up space in someone's life was not something I had to apologize for or explain or justify. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about forever. I'm thinking about whether you want that." She said, "Your kitchen or mine?" I said, "Ours. Eventually, if that's what you want." She said, "Yeah?" I said, "Yeah." We moved in together 6 months later. It was a decision I made, with her, after months of knowing that I could trust my own judgment. After months of making choices based on what I wanted instead of what I thought someone else needed from me. After months of understanding that I had agency, and that agency was not something I needed anyone's permission to have. The moving process was different than it had been with Iris. When I moved in with Iris, I had carefully asked which of my things she thought would fit with her aesthetic. I had suggested my furniture and waited for her approval before actually bringing it into the space. I had made myself small in her apartment, had accepted that her vision for the space was more important than mine. With Mira, I just brought my things. I brought my art and hung it on the walls. I brought my books and filled the shelves. I brought my kitchen tools and they lived next to hers. There was no negotiation about whose taste dominated. We both just existed in the space, taking up room in equal measure. The apartment was big enough for 2 people to move through without apology. The kitchen was large enough that we could both cook at the same time. The space felt like it was designed for 2 people to exist in together, without one of them disappearing to make room. It was designed for 2 people to flourish in their own ways, alongside each other, rather than one person managing the other's existence. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, just existing in the space, reminding myself that I was allowed to be there, reminding myself that cooking at 2 in the morning was not something I had to ask permission for, reminding myself that taking up space was not a crime. Mira would find me there and wrap her arms around me from behind and say, "You're safe." And I would believe her, because she had proven it through patience, through honesty, through the specific act of loving me enough to let me go before she kept me, through showing me, every single day, what it looked like when someone loved you without needing to control you. Iris moved to Portland 6 months after Mira and I got together. She sent me a message on my birthday saying she was sorry, that she understood now what she had been doing, that she was working on it in therapy, that she hoped I was happy. It was a good message. It was also the last message she sent. I never responded. I didn't need to. I had already forgiven her, which is different from condoning what she did. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, so you're not carrying the weight of it anymore. Forgiveness is understanding why someone did something without accepting that it was okay. Mira never asked me to forgive her sister. She never asked me to understand Iris's perspective, or to consider how hard it was for Iris to let go of control. She understood that Iris had hurt me, and she never tried to make that smaller, or more acceptable, or less real. What she did was this. She showed me, every single day, what it looked like when someone loved you without needing to control you. When someone wanted you in the kitchen. When someone was proud of you for taking up space. When someone was willing to wait, and to let you choose, and to trust that if you chose her, you were choosing her freely, without coercion, without obligation, without someone's version of what love should look like imposed on top of your own. We got engaged 2 years after we moved in together. It was not a surprise. I had been thinking about it for months. I bought a ring and I gave it to her on a random Tuesday morning while we were making breakfast together. I said, "I want to do this. I want to choose this. Every single day, I want to choose you." She said yes, before I even finished asking. We got married a year after that. It was not a big wedding. It was the kind of wedding where the people who showed up were the people who actually cared. Mira's mother Helen came. She was 75 years old and looked exactly like the kind of woman who had spent her entire life believing that control was love. She had softened slightly over the years, but you could still see the edges of her, the places where she had carved herself into everything around her. She cried during the ceremony. Not the kind of tears that come from joy, but the kind that come from recognition. From seeing something play out that you had a hand in creating. From understanding, finally, the cost of your choices. She came up to me afterward and said, "I'm sorry for what I taught my daughters." I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "Mira told me what Iris did. She told me that Iris learned it from me, that I learned it from my mother, that this is a cycle." I spent my entire life thinking I was protecting my girls by controlling their world. Instead, I was teaching them that love means possession. I was teaching them that the only way to keep someone safe is to make them smaller. She paused. She was looking at her hands, at how they had spent decades organizing, managing, controlling. She said, "I had Iris when I was terrified that my life was falling apart. Her father was unpredictable, and I couldn't manage him, and so I tried to control the one thing I thought I could control her. I tried to make her into something safe, something predictable, something that wouldn't leave me the way her father did. And in doing that, I turned her into someone who hurts people by loving them the only way she knows how." I believed her. People can change if they're willing to account for what they've done, if they're willing to sit with the discomfort of knowing that they hurt someone, if they're willing to do the work. Helen was doing the work. It was harder for her than it would have been to just pretend she hadn't done anything wrong. But she was doing it. Iris didn't come to the wedding. She sent a gift instead, a beautiful wooden cutting board, hand-carved, clearly expensive, clearly chosen with care, and a note that said, "I hope you have a kitchen where you can be as loud as you want to be. I hope you cook every single day, and that nobody ever asks you to be quiet about it." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. We hung the cutting board in our kitchen. Every time I use it, I remember the woman I was when I was trying to be small. I remember the way I felt when Iris told me I couldn't cook. I remember the moment Mira showed me that there was another option. I remember the moment I chose to leave. I remember the 3 months of waiting. I remember the moment I realized that I wanted to choose Mira not because she was available but because she was what I wanted. I cook a lot now. I cook loudly. I cook at 2 in the morning if I feel like it. I take up space in the kitchen and in the world, and nobody tells me I should apologize for it. Mira sits at the counter sometimes and watches me cook. She doesn't manage it. She doesn't redirect it. She doesn't suggest that maybe I should try things a different way. She just watches, like I'm the most interesting thing she's ever seen. Like my autonomy is something worth witnessing. Like my choices are sacred and deserve her attention. Sometimes I catch her looking at me while I'm cooking, and she's smiling in a way that suggests she's thinking about the future, about decades of this, about a kitchen that will be ours and belong to both of us equally. This is what love looks like when it's not about control. This is what it looks like when someone wants you to be yourself, entirely and loudly, and without apology. This is what it looks like when someone loves you enough to let you go, and then loves you enough to stay when you choose to come back. Iris taught me what it feels like to be loved in the wrong way, to be managed and reorganized and slowly dissolved into someone else's vision of what you should be, to have every choice questioned, every preference redirected, every autonomous decision presented as evidence of your own inadequacy. But Mira taught me something else. She taught me what it feels like to be loved in the right way, to be seen clearly and accepted as you are, to have your autonomy treated as sacred. To have someone say, without words, that your freedom matters more than their comfort, that your growth matters more than their control, that your choices matter more than their preferences. The difference between these two kinds of love is the difference between being trapped and being free, between disappearing and existing, between questioning yourself constantly and trusting yourself entirely. I think about Iris sometimes. I wonder if she's still trying to reorganize the world so it makes sense to her. I wonder if she's learned that control is a cage that locks both people inside. I wonder if she's realized that the more tightly you hold something, the more likely it is to shatter in your hands. But mostly, I don't think about Iris at all. I think about the way Mira looks at me when I'm cooking. I think about the kitchen that belongs to both of us. I think about the future that I'm building with someone who loves me by letting me be free. This is what I should have had from the beginning. This is what I have now. This is what I get to keep. And I will never take it for granted again.